And so George was an early recognizer of this and started to put the emphasis on direct training for shoot boxing in addition to wrestling. So he practiced with very good wrestlers in the Montreal Wrestling Club, just the sport of wrestling. And that's what made him very good at finishing takedowns. But it was in his shoot boxing training, which he himself largely developed. Remember, George started at a time when MMA was pretty damn young. And when you entered the sport of mixed martial arts, George, it wasn't even allowed on TV. Like, it was completely banned. It was in his country, it was physically banned. They had to fight on Indian reservations, and this is way back in the Wild West days of MMA. And so, as a young developing athlete, he had to more or less do this by himself. If you ever want to hear some incredible stories, talk about teenage George St-Pierre. Had a coach who used to make him put on boxing gloves. Now, he was 16, 17 years old, and just put him on a hardwood floor against a professional boxer who was in his late 20s at the peak of his career. And he said, "George, you're not allowed to punch. You just got to take him down while he tries to knock you out." And it was it was crazy.
It was like Darwinism. He was like, it's like you're gonna adapt or you're gonna die. Literally. Like,
and he adapted.
It could have been very bad, but it turns out to be great. His methods.
But there's a sense here in which people think, what determines your takedown ability in MMA is your wrestling skill. That your wrestling skill will determine your finishing ability on takedowns. But there's so much more to it than that. Whenever people say, what are the broad elements that determine the outcome of a mixed martial arts fight? Okay, on the broadest possible level, and I always give the same three things. The athlete who can dominate the pace of the match, the athlete who can dominate the direction of the match, and the athlete who can dominate the setups will win the vast majority of fights they're in. Those three things, the direction, the pace, and the setups. You dominate all three of those, you're going to win 90% of the matches you're in. George could always dominate the direction of the fight because he could stop the other guy taking him down, and he could impose his own takedowns at any point in a match. So whether it went to ground or whether it stayed standing was always up to him. George had the most sophisticated array of setups into takedowns that I've personally ever witnessed. The whole distinction between reactive and proactive takedowns came very early in George's career, and he excelled in both. Most people tend to favor one or the other. Most athletes have a very hard time imposing their setups on an opponent, and as a result, they have to use the cage as a crutch for their setups, where they just bully someone towards the cage and then put them down on the cage. George is one of the very few people who was equally good against the cage or in the open, and could do so in both proactive and reactive situations. And the scary thing is that as good as all of you saw him look in the octagon, anyone who knows George as a coach will tell you he was twice as good as that in the gym, where he would often go against people several weight divisions above himself. I could sit here all day. I won't name names, but I always laugh when people say, "Oh, this is the greatest pound for pound guy of all time." And I've personally seen George take that guy down and crush him in the gym, and I can't say anything because it's rude to talk about that in public because it's just training. But I've seen George go with people all the way up to light heavyweight, some of the greatest names in the history of the sport, put them down, advanced position on the ground, and dominate them in training. It's what he did during that time. George, I got to say, I deeply admire many of the things I saw you do, not just in the octagon, but in training as well. It's the impact that you had on the degree to which takedowns were used in the sport was absolutely inspirational. That's why one of the reasons why I always say you're one of the only athlete I ever met who taught me more than I taught you, because you opened my eyes to a whole new world of shoot boxing, and how I grew up in a time when I was laughing before when you talked about Sugar Ray Leonard. I was a kid watching that match, and I grew up in a time where there was boxing and there was kickboxing. And then I came to America and I learned grappling. And this young man here was the innovator when it came to the integration of the two.